Nothing beats verbal communication. With all the new technologies arising in the world, there is a decrease in face-to-face communication, which just goes to show how crucial verbal communication is now more than ever. I myself admit to choosing to communicate through a screen rather than in person. Can you imagine having to tell someone something extremely important or devastating over text message? It is said that every 1 in 5 Americans is cell phone dependent. So let's find out how important verbal communication is and see how it truly impacts our lives. Verbal communication is important not only because it is a faster way to explain your thoughts, but it also gets your point across more effectively. My name is Alexis Garcia, and in the next few minutes, I'm going to explain the importance of verbal communication. Firstly, I will explain how it affects your everyday lives. Second, I will explain how it is involved in relationship development. And lastly, I will explain how it creates individuality. To begin, verbal communication either assists or hinders relationship and technology development. Without using real communication, would you be able to tell your family, I lost my keys this morning, so I wasn't able to go to school, so I just didn't go, and then I found my keys later in the day? Verbal communication is what creates meaning in conversation. Although you can include emojis and funny pictures to portray your mood and mimic a nonverbal event, verbal messages are still essential on social media sites as well. You can only use nonverbal communication so much, which is why verbal communication is so important. Next, it is involved in identity and relationship development. So you become the person you are through the people you communicate and hang around with. Humans are social creatures, and we're all highly influenced by the people around us each day. And whoever you spend your time with will have an impact on the way you behave. For example, if you spend your time with a successful and wealthy businessman, then over time, you will pick up their habits and mindset and mimic their way of being successful as well. A study also found that families who engage in conversation and eat meals together on a regular, daily basis have children who are not only more familiar with their family history, but also have higher self-esteem, communicate better with their peer mates and others, and also have more resilience. Finally, the language spoken creates individuality. The language people speak is tied to their identities. In a study, researchers found that bilingual and multilingual speakers have altered personalities and behaviors when they're changing the language that they speak. But why does this happen? When people learn a new language, the culture, the beliefs, and the values come with it all as well, which is why speaking a language brings out more of the culture and gives the person speaking a feeling of who they are within that culture as well. In the past few minutes, I talked about the importance of verbal communication and conversing face-to-face. First, I discussed how it affects our everyday lives. Second, I addressed how it is involved in relationship development. And lastly, I explained how it creates individuality. Remember when I said that every 1 in 5 Americans is cell phone dependent? Well, this statistic could change if we all decided to stop hiding behind a screen and speak up for ourselves. Thank you. The next speaker is Madison, and she will be talking about the components and functions of language.
Describing the functions and components of language. First, I will discuss how verbal communication has to do with more than just the words we speak. Secondly, I will describe the 7 different functions of language. And lastly, I will explain and examine the components of language and how it makes up a sentence. So what did I mean when I said verbal communication has to do with more than just the words we speak? It means it talks about our tone or which words we use together or how we pronounce specific words. Now that I've told you about how verbal communication has to do with more than just the words we speak, but more of how you word a sentence or the tone you use or specific words you use together, I'm going to discuss the 7 different functions of language. The 7 different functions of language include imaginative, heuristic, personal, interactional, regulatory, instrumental, and informative. Informative language is used to communicate important facts, such as in an argument or an argumentative essay, you would use certain facts to support your argument to make it even stronger. Instrumental language is used to get what you want. Regulatory language is used to control others' behavior. Interactional language is used to create social relationships. And personal language is used to express individuality and personality. So you can use personal experiences or trips you went on to connect with other people, but also showing them who you are as a person and what you stand for. Imaginative language is used to express yourself in a creative way, and heuristic language is used to gain knowledge. Now that I've explained the 7 different functions of language, I'm going to explain and examine the components of language. There are 8 different components of language: grammar, phonology, syntax, semantics, denotive meaning, connotative meaning, programmatics, and speech theory. So grammar is the rules that give meaning in language. Phonology is the sounds that make up a word. So it's the study of different sounds coming together to make up a whole entire word, like phenomenon. Different sounds making up one word. Syntax are the rules that govern word order. Next we have semantics. Semantics is the word's meaning or definition behind the word. Now we have denotative meaning and connotative meaning. Denotative meaning is the literal meaning of the word, i.e. the definition. Connotative meaning is the positive or negative effect the word has on someone or something. Another component of language would be pragmatics. Pragmatics is the study of how language is used in specific situations, or the words you use in a practical sense. Lastly, we have speech theory. Speech theory is the theory that you do not just say things with your words, but you also do things with your words. For example, if you say, "I bet you $10 you cannot do 5 backflips and land a perfect landing." You're not just saying those words, you're actually betting on them, which would be the act. So overall, I explained how verbal communication has to do with more than just the words you speak, the 7 different functions of language, and I explained and examined the components that make up language.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and I'll be talking about Section 3 of Chapter 4, which discusses the different factors that influence how we communicate as individuals. The most important factors are gender, age, race and ethnicity, regionality, and education and occupation. I'll start off with gender. So generally in our society, men and women communicate in the same way. However, cultural gender biases affect how we see them communicate. Women are generally seen as communicating in a supportive, egalitarian, and personal way, whereas men are seen as communicating competitively or assertively. This is usually because of power dynamics, and in our culture, women are generally of lower status. So we tend to take on a supportive role in a conversation. However, in the same situation, if a man was put in a position of lower status, they tend to play to the person of higher power in their audience. For age, we tend to change our lexical choices as we grow up, or just the words we use. For instance, an adult would say germs or something sexual instead of saying cooties, but a kid would say cooties. But we tend to keep the speech characteristics of our generation we were born in. For instance, someone might still say groovy now, even though that isn't the hip word to use at this time, but they used it when they were growing up. All right, for race and ethnicity, your first language that you learned, if it was different from English, might create an accent in the English you speak, or even a dialect if you're around people who speak a similar language. Even if English is a co-language and you learned it at the same time, it would definitely affect how you pronounce or how you phrase words. For instance, if you grew up speaking Spanish, you might place the verb before the adjective because that's how it is in Spanish. And geographically, for regionality, if you're more isolated, an accent tends to develop more. So say you're isolated with a group of people who all speak your same language or are from your same country, then you would all tend to develop a similar accent. But if you were split off, even if you're from the same country, like say across a river or something like that, you would probably both develop different accents or dialects for the same language. The last influence is education and occupation. So the higher the education you have, generally, the more similar you talk to everyone else around you that is in the same education range. This is because if you move away from college, you're away from your dialect and you're in the same area with everyone else, but you're also just learning in the same environment and gaining more knowledge. For occupation, every job has certain words that they use, like jargon. For instance, you probably wouldn't understand what a surgeon says if you work at a restaurant, and vice versa. So you would probably speak with those words in your everyday, even though people from your job wouldn't necessarily be in your everyday life. So that definitely influences how you communicate. All right, and on to my next group member, Eliza, who will talk about how language interacts with perception. Thank you.
Before I start today, I'd like to show you the note card I will be using. Hello, my name is Eliza Perez, and today I will be presenting on Chapter 4, Objective Number 4. Objective number 4 is the individual, verbal communication, and society, language, perception, and power. To effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as a guide to our community with others, a quote said by Anthony Robbins. In the next few minutes, I will talk about the individual, verbal communication, and society, language, perception, and power. First, I will talk about the bond between language and perception. Next, I will discuss the impact power has on language. Then, I will explain how power has labeled identities of people in society. Language and perception have been an ongoing issue and have been debated. The words of culture influencing how people proceed in the world. There are two types of people, one of them being the nominalist. They claim that an idea can be expressed in any language and the structure does not affect the speaker's perception. Then we have the relativist that argue that language serves a way for us to speak but helps shapes our ideas. I would consider myself a relativist because words help me express who I am and the structure, and it helps me get to the point. Now that I've talked about language and perception, I will discuss the impact power has on language. People in society that hold power get to define the styles of languages that are appropriate. Our society sees white people, heterosexuals, able bodies, middle and upper class as the people in power. For example, if a woman didn't speak as or like males in a corporation, she could be potentially labeled as weak. Being a woman, people don't really take me serious because I'm not directly to the point or speak without emotion. And now that I explained the impact power has on language, I will discuss how power has labeled the identities of people. People are discriminated the way they talk or if they speak different languages and if they speak uneducated English. For example, my grandma, her first language is Spanish and she has a bit of an accent, and people have treated her differently because of her accent, and she has been labeled as an immigrant. In conclusion, the individual, verbal communication, and society, language, perception, and power all have a connection. First, I talked about the bond between language and perception. Secondly, I discussed the impact that power had on language. And then finally, I discussed how power had labeled the identities of people in society. This topic is still relevant in society today. Thank you, and I will introduce Mauricio doing objective number 5.
Hey everyone, my name is Mauricio Leon, and I am doing this confirming communication, and I'm doing hate speech and what necessarily that means, and to give you like a broad example of what this really is. Okay, so this year is 2020. We're aware of what's transpired this year. There has been shootings. Kobe Bryant died, and a lot of things happened. During 2020, there was a whole ordeal about George Floyd. There was a lot of hate speech telling black people, all lives matter, and sometimes that rubbed, African Americans or even Hispanic people the wrong way because we were very passionate. So we would consider that hate speech. Okay, we would consider that hate speech, and I feel like for my race, my Mexicans, Hispanics, my people, we had to deal with a lot of mistreatment from other people. We were called some. I have a story. I've been called a beaner once. That would be considered hate speech. So hate speech is conforming communication is meant to put someone in, and make a person feel bad about themselves. So say if my sister were to come up to me and say, "Hey, guess what? I aced that quiz. I got an A plus." I would respond saying, "Oh, that means the quiz must have been easy." That's this conforming communication. Now, conforming communication would be if my sister comes and she tells me, "Oh, guess what, brother? I aced that quiz. I got an A plus." And I said, "Oh, every day, communicating, we deal with it every day too. We communicate with people every day. So let's just give conforming communication to everyone, and we'll be fine." And yeah, thank you, Jacob. Jacobson.
How many of you have found yourself in a conversation and couldn't stay engaged and keep the convo going? This is something we all have struggled with. Hello, my name is Jacob, and today I'll talk about ways to improve your verbal communication skills. First, I'll talk about why you should always think before giving a response. Second, you should always have confidence and making eye contact with the person. And lastly, I'll discuss why being a good listener is also a way to improve your verbal communication skills. When we're in a conversation, we tend to think about what to say next or don't have a response at all, although it depends on the conversation you're having. You should always think before giving a response because it can either help people or hurt people if it rolls off your tongue the wrong way. Also, your words can have a lot of power and meaning towards the person on any discussion you have. And lastly, your words can reflect on the type of person you are and what you're like. These are all important factors to have in a conversation, but without making eye contact and having confidence, the conversation won't last long. In conversations, people tend to feel shy or look at the ground while speaking. That's probably because they're afraid to speak out or they're just not comfortable around the person. When speaking with confidence, you're more calm and focused and can manage your thoughts better. You also believe in yourself more in the statements you say, and having confidence is attractive. There are simple things you can do like practice, take deep breaths, or inserting a smile. With this comes eye contact. By doing this, you and the listener build a bigger bond or relationship because of the connection you guys are having. You're grabbing their attention by the message you're trying to give out. These are all important factors to include in a conversation, but none of this matters if you're not a good listener. Sometimes you may be bored or just zone out or just not be interested in the conversation anymore, but at least show some empathy and actually listen to what they're trying to say. By listening, you understand the person's topic and the perspective they're coming from. You may also have something in common with them when they're trying to speak. And lastly, it could make the person feel more valuable because you're putting your time and effort into listening. With that being said, I discussed ways on improving your verbal communication skills. I talked about thinking before giving a response, having confidence, and making eye contact is important. And lastly, I talked about why being a good listener is a key role into improving your verbal communication skills. With all the information given, I hope you all understood what our group has provided for you about verbal communication skills, and hopefully you will use our examples we explain in your next conversation.